What's going on, friends? In our quest for power on our Harleys, we're always looking for the quickest, easiest, simplest way to make power. But do throttle bodies and intake manifolds hold the secret to the Harley power that we're looking for? Now, while I have my opinions on larger throttle bodies and intake manifolds, do they actually work, and are they worth the money? Just like air cleaners, theoretically, you put more air in the engine, and by putting more air in the engine, you're going to get more power output. Well, to the contrary to that, your engine is nothing but a big air pump, and it's really limited by the displacement of your cylinders. So being limited by the displacement in your cylinders, this is going to really dictate how much air you can actually pump, no matter how much air you put into it. Now, throttle bodies and intake manifolds are not cheap, so we really don't want to spend money that we don't necessarily have to. But in some cases, depending on which motor you have in your Harley, this can actually be a two-pronged approach. And we're going to take a look at that, as well as look at some dyno numbers later in the video. Guys, please don't forget, if you enjoy the video today, please don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. A larger throttle body and air intake manifold have one job, and that is to move air that's coming from your high flow air cleaner through the engine and to the cylinders. Now, your engine is only going to use so much air just depending on the bore size. You can't necessarily over air the engine because it's only going to take and use so much, like you could overfuel a bike by putting bigger injectors in it and just dumping a bunch of fuel in there. Now, on the contrary, when it comes to air, you could definitely starve the bike for air. If you've ever looked in the Screamin' Eagle catalog, which I'm sure pretty much all of us have at one point or another, and looked at the stage kits, and especially the stage 4 kits, you really start to notice a pattern with the stage 4 kits. Pretty much every single one of these kits comes with a larger throttle body and intake manifold. Even the stage 4 kit for the Sportster comes with a 58mm throttle body. They essentially took a twin cam throttle body and stuck it on the side of a Sportster, upgrading it from its 45mm stock size. So when you're in the Screamin' Eagle catalog and you see all of their top shelf stage 4 kits all come with a larger throttle body and intake manifold, it really leads a lot of people to believe that this is the Harley secret to horsepower. This has got to be that secret sauce that puts you over the top. The Milwaukee 8, for example, it has a 55mm throttle body stock. Now, you really think putting a 58mm throttle body on a Sportster is going to make a whole lot of difference? Well, we'll get to that later. But a Milwaukee 8, 55mm stock throttle body. Now, this is a composite plastic throttle body, but that has some issues of its own, which we'll talk about that here in a minute. But Harley-Davidson also offers their Extreme Flow intake manifold through Screamin' Eagle, in which they claim roughly about a 2 to 4% increase in horsepower. Let's take a look at a 114. Got a high flow air cleaner, got a good exhaust on it, it's got a tune in it, with a Wood WMA 22XD cam. This is using the stock 55mm, the carbon, plastic, whatever you want to call it, it's made out of, intake manifold, 55mm, and then we'll take a look at the same bike, but with one difference. It's got the Screamin' Eagle cast aluminum piece, the Extreme Flow manifold on it. With the stock 55mm manifold, which is a composite plastic piece, we're getting about 118 horsepower and 128 foot-pounds of torque. Now, adding a cast aluminum intake manifold with the same cam, we're getting 120 horsepower and still roughly 128 pound-feet of torque. Not really much gain there, considering that Screamin' Eagle intake manifold will run you about $200. I guess that might be worth it if you want just a little extra out of your cam, especially if you're going to install it yourself. That way you're not being buried in labor charges for roughly a $200 part. Now, here's the secret if you didn't catch it. The Milwaukee 8's intake manifold is a composite plastic piece, and the Screamin' Eagle intake manifold, while both 55mm, is a cast aluminum piece. Now, over time on the Milwaukee 8 with the stock intake manifold, with the heat cycles, the hot and the cold, these things can actually warp over time and start to create intake leaks, or even worse, if you had a very hot, high head temperature for an extended period of time, these things can even melt. So if you have a Milwaukee 8 and you're starting to have some intake leaks and you're trying to chase those down, start with that composite plastic intake manifold. So definitely upgrading that for a couple $100 to the Screaming Eagle aluminum piece, that could definitely be worth your while just for that right there. So what if we went ahead and upgraded to a 64mm throttle body with a 64mm intake, that is about 9mm bigger than stock, and then we really start to push some air through this bike, at least making the air available for the motorcycle to take in. So let's take a look at a 114 with a really nice cam that's going to have exhaust, air cleaner, and a tune, and also the stock intake and throttle body, just kind of give us another baseline. Now on this bike, it's running a Wood WM8 22XE, which is basically the top of the line monster horsepower and torque cam, running a D&D exhaust, which is no doubt impressive as it is, netting 119 horsepower and 133 foot-pounds of torque. Now, let's throw in a 64mm throttle body with matching intake manifold, same Wood WM8 22XE cam, air cleaner and exhaust. We're getting 124 horsepower and 132 foot-pounds of torque. Very comparable numbers, comparable in being the torque maybe dropped off a point, but we did gain 5 horsepower on the exact same setup, with the only thing changed, adding a 64mm throttle body and intake manifold. This really isn't a bad gain at all on a 114 Harley. By no means is it a bad gain, but that extra 5 horsepower and even losing a point on the torque, that may not really be worth the money invested into a 64mm throttle body and intake manifold at that displacement level. So is the throttle body and intake manifold the Harley power secret that we're all looking for? Well, let's take a look at a Stage 4 kit. This is the Harley-Davidson kit with the 64mm throttle body. It's got all the Screaming Eagle parts on it, plus the Screaming Eagle cam on a 114. So guys, looking at the dyno, the blue lines are a Stage 4 Screaming Eagle 114 kit with a dealer tune running the Screaming Eagle 515 from the kit, which made 100 horsepower and about 107 foot-pounds of torque. Now in the red is with a Wood WM8 408 cam swapped in, and what a difference a cam will make with 125 horsepower and 126 foot-pounds of torque. 25 horsepower and a 19 foot-pound of torque gain by doing nothing more than a cam swap. This is why I've always said the Screaming Eagle parts really aren't all that bad. It's just always the camshafts that really hold them back. So guys, larger throttle bodies and intake manifolds really don't make that big of a difference if you have a stock displacement motorcycle. Now, if you have a very large displacement motorcycle, these can make all the difference, up to not just a 5 horsepower swing, but even a 10 and 15 horsepower swing, depending on how many cubic inches you got and how much air you actually need to move through the motor. The Harley secret to power really still lies with the camshafts, in my opinion, on displacements under 120 inches, and that is still very true on a displacement over 120 inches. Now, of course, if you have a Milwaukee 8 or a twin cam, definitely anything over 120 inches or bigger, that is really where that throttle body is going to come into play. Now, even if you have a very hot Sportster where you went to an 88 or a 90 inch kit, yeah, I could see a 58mm throttle body coming into play there as well. So just to show you guys an example, here's a 107 Milwaukee 8 converted to a 120 inch displacement with a 64mm throttle body and intake with a S&S 550 cam, making almost 132 horsepower and 134 foot-pounds of torque. Now that is the kind of power where that large throttle body and intake manifold really come into play. When you're laying down those kind of numbers with those kind of inches, it is imperative to have that large throttle body and intake manifold. Now, as I mentioned, anything under 120, yes, you're going to get somewhat, maybe a minute gain or something out of it, but it's nothing that's going to blow the roof off. And considering a throttle body and intake manifold can run you anywhere from $600 to $1,000, that's a lot of money for very little gain. And in my opinion, that's money that can be spent elsewhere, like a cam plate, a high volume oil pump, or even a new hotter cam and bearings, everything else associated with installing those. And honestly, if you really just want a good little bump over what you've got, porting the stock throttle body is really kind of one of the best things you could do for the money. A lot of times you can get this professionally done for about $100. You can even port the intake manifolds as well, like on the twin cams and Sportsters. I don't really recommend that on the Milwaukee 8 with the OEM intake, with it being a composite plastic. Yeah, don't do that. Those things are already thin enough and brittle as it is after all the hot and cold cycles. Last thing you want to do is make it even thinner. So anyhow, guys, 120 cubic inches or bigger, probably going to need to look at getting you a larger throttle body intake manifold. Anything under, round the stock displacements, cam swaps, mild head porting, things like that, you're going to be just fine with the stock unit. As I mentioned, just go ahead and port the stock unit. That'll get you a nice little gain, couple 3 horsepower. That's worth $100 in my book. But anyhow, guys, that's all I've got for you this week. Please don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But until next week, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. You guys stay safe on the streets, ride smart, dodge the cars, and I'll catch you guys back here with a brand new video next week. Thanks for watching.